Lila and I have been best friends since we were 6. She moved into the house across the street from mine, and we clicked immediately. I was the quiet, shy kid, and Lila was all confidence and charm. She had this way of making everything feel exciting, adventurous even. Growing up, we did everything together. Sleepovers, school projects, summer camps, you name it. By the time we got to high school, it was a given that we were a package deal. People used to joke that we were like sisters, but I always felt like Lila was the more magnetic one. She could walk into a room and have everyone's attention in seconds, while I preferred to stay in the background. That dynamic never really bothered me. If anything, I admired her for it. I thought we complemented each other. Her boldness balanced my quieter personality. Even when people would say things like, "Oh, you're so lucky to have her as a best friend," I never let it get to me. When we both got into the same college, I was thrilled. We spent hours planning our dorm setup and fantasizing about all the wild adventures we'd have. I really thought college was going to be our time to shine together, but in hindsight, there were small cracks I didn't see back then. Lila's charm wasn't just magnetic, it was competitive. She loved being the center of attention, and as much as I loved her for it, I realize now that she always seemed a little annoyed when someone else outshined her. At first, everything seemed normal. We went to parties, met new people, and joined a few clubs. It was fun, and I felt like we were on top of the world. But then, little things started happening that didn't sit right with me. I'd meet a guy, and Lila would joke about how she didn't get what he saw in me. Or if I got a compliment at a party, she'd chime in with something like, "Yeah, but she's totally awkward when she's nervous." Stuff like that. I told myself she was just teasing. It's what friends do, right? Looking back, it's clear now. Those little digs weren't jokes. They were seeds. And I had no idea what Lila was growing behind my back. College life was everything I hoped for at first. Lila and I were busy with classes, exploring the campus, and hitting every party we could find. We even joined a few clubs. She got into theater, and I signed up for the art society. It felt like we were thriving in our own ways while still being the unstoppable duo we'd always been. But there were these moments with Lila that started to feel off. At first, I brushed them aside. Like this one time, we were at a party, and I started chatting with this guy, Ian. He was in one of my classes, super sweet, and we hit it off right away. Lila swooped in with her usual charm, and we all ended up talking together. But the more Ian and I talked, the more Lila seemed to insert herself. She'd laugh a little too loudly at her own jokes, or she'd subtly shift the conversation toward herself. It was like she needed Ian's attention, like she couldn't stand that someone was focusing on me for once. Later that night, I made an offhand comment about how nice Ian was, and Lila raised her eyebrows. "Ian? Really?" she said, dragging out the word like she couldn't believe it. "He's cute, I guess, but not really your type, don't you think?" Her tone was light, like she wasn't being serious, but it left me feeling unsettled. What did she mean? Not my type. I didn't even know I had a type. Then there was another night when we were getting ready for a party. I was trying on a new dress, something a little more daring than my usual style, and I was excited about how it looked. Lila gave me a once-over and said, "That's cute, but don't you think it's a bit much? You don't want to look like you're trying too hard." Again, it wasn't mean exactly, but it was enough to make me second-guess myself. I ended up changing into something more low-key, and, of course, Lila showed up to the party looking like a model. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I told myself that's just how Lila was, bold and confident, while I was more reserved. But now, looking back, I can't help but wonder if those little comments were meant to keep me in her shadow. The real kicker came a few weeks later. Ian and I had been texting back and forth, just casual stuff, nothing serious yet, and I was starting to feel like maybe there was something there. One night, Lila casually mentioned that she'd run into Ian on campus, and they'd grabbed coffee together. "Oh, don't worry," she said with a laugh when she saw my face. "It wasn't a date or anything. He just saw me and wanted to catch up. You should totally go for it." It was such a weird moment. On the surface, it seemed harmless, but there was something in the way she said it that made my stomach twist. Why would Ian ask her to coffee? And why did she feel the need to tell me about it like that? I told myself I was overthinking things. Lila was my best friend. She'd always had my back. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Something wasn't adding up, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was missing a bigger picture. After the whole Ian and coffee thing, I started paying more attention. It wasn't like I thought Lila was up to something. I mean, she was my best friend, but there was this uneasiness I couldn't explain. Ian stopped texting me as much after that. At first, I thought he was just busy, but then I saw him at another party. He gave me this awkward wave from across the room, but instead of coming over, he veered off in the other direction. I caught Lila watching him too, a little smirk on her face like she knew something I didn't. I tried to ask her about it later, casually of course. So, what's up with Ian? Did he say anything about me when you guys got coffee? She shrugged, barely looking up from her phone. Not really. I mean, we talked about classes and stuff. Oh! He did mention he's not really looking to date anyone right now. I guess he's just focusing on himself or whatever. It stung, but I told myself to let it go. Maybe Ian wasn't interested, and that was fine. But then I started noticing a pattern. It wasn't just Ian. Every time I mentioned a guy I was interested in, Lila would find a way to make me second-guess myself. If I said I thought a guy was cute, she'd wrinkle her nose and say something like, "Really? You think so?" Or if I started talking to someone at a party, Lila would conveniently need to interrupt for some reason, dragging me away to dance or suddenly deciding she needed a drink. I tried to brush it off as coincidence, but it kept happening. And it wasn't just about guys either. One day, I was excited about a painting I'd done for my art class. It wasn't perfect, but it was something I was proud of. I showed it to Lila, hoping for her usual enthusiasm. Instead, she tilted her head and said, "It's nice, but don't you think the colors clash a little? Like, maybe it's just me, but it feels kind of unfinished." I laughed it off, but her words stuck with me. By the next day, I couldn't even look at the painting without feeling embarrassed. I started to wonder if I was imagining things. Was I just being overly sensitive? Or was there something deeper going on? Every time I tried to push those thoughts aside, another moment would pop up, a small comment here, a strange look there. I didn't want to believe it. Lila was my best friend. She couldn't be trying to undermine me. But the doubts were growing louder, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. The thing about doubt is that it sneaks up on you. It's like a tiny crack in a windshield. You don't notice it at first, but the more you drive, the bigger it gets. And that's exactly how I felt with Lila. One afternoon, I decided to test the waters a little. There was this guy, Matt, in my art history class who had been chatting with me a lot lately. He was funny and sweet, and he'd even started walking me back to my dorm after class. I hadn't told Lila about him yet, partly because I wasn't sure where it was going, and partly because I wanted to see what would happen if I kept him to myself for a while. But then, one night, we were hanging out in our room, and Lila spotted a text from Matt on my phone. "Who's Matt?" she asked, grinning like she already knew. "Just this guy from my art history class," I said casually, trying to play it cool. "Oh," she teased, dragging out the word. "Do you like him?" I laughed and shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. He's nice." Lila's grin widened, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd been wrong about her. She seemed genuinely happy for me. "You should totally go for it," she said, nudging me with her elbow. "He sounds perfect for you." It felt good to hear her say that, and I started to relax. Maybe I really was overthinking everything, but then, the very next day, something weird happened. Matt and I had plans to grab coffee after class, but when I showed up at the cafe, he wasn't there. I waited for a while, thinking maybe he was running late, but he never showed. Later that evening, I got a text from him apologizing. He said something had come up, but the message felt distant. I asked if everything was okay, and he just replied with a short, "Yeah, no worries. Talk soon." I couldn't figure out what had changed. Just the day before, he'd been walking me to my dorm, joking about how he'd ace our next quiz. Now, it was like he couldn't get away from me fast enough. When I got back to the dorm, Lila was there, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and gave me a little smile. "How was coffee with Matt?" she asked, her voice dripping with curiosity. "He canceled," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Something came up, I guess." Lila frowned. "Weird. I saw him earlier, and he didn't say anything about being busy. Maybe he's just shy?" It was such a small comment, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. Why was Matt suddenly pulling away? And why was Lila talking to him at all? I didn't say anything, but the doubt was back, stronger than ever. Something wasn't right, and I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't all in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about what Lila had said. Why was she even talking to Matt in the first place? Sure, we were all on the same campus, but it felt like she was always conveniently bumping into the guys I liked. Over the next few days, things with Matt went from promising to practically non-existent. He still sat near me in class, but he didn't go out of his way to talk to me anymore. The warm, easy conversations we'd been having felt forced, and he stopped walking me back to the dorm. I tried not to let it get to me. People lose interest all the time, right? Maybe he'd just decided we weren't a match, and that was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The tipping point came a week later. I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw a new post from Lila. It was a picture of her and Matt, sitting on the steps of one of the campus buildings. She was laughing, leaning toward him like they were sharing some private joke. The caption read, "Study buddy vibes, Victor Hand." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My stomach churned as I stared at the photo. What was she doing with him? And why didn't she tell me about it? When I confronted her later, I tried to sound casual. "So, you and Matt are hanging out now?" I asked, holding up my phone with her post on the screen. Lila barely glanced at it. "Oh, that? Yeah, we just ran into each other on campus and decided to study together. He's actually really smart. You should have told me he's into art history. I might have asked for his help earlier." Her tone was light, playful even, but it didn't sit right with me. "Did he say anything about me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated for just a second. So quick I almost missed it. "Not really. I mean, he said you're sweet and all, but I don't think he's looking for anything serious right now." There it was again, that same line she'd fed me about Ian. Not looking for anything serious. It felt rehearsed, like she was trying to plant the idea in my head. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I was just being paranoid, that this was all some big misunderstanding. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how often this kind of thing had been happening. I told myself I'd let it slide this time. Maybe she really was just being friendly with Matt. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. Lila was my best friend, but something about her behavior didn't add up, and I was determined to figure out what was going on. After the thing with Matt, I couldn't unsee the pattern anymore. Every time I showed interest in a guy, Lila would somehow end up in the middle of it. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things, like bumping into them by chance, or finding ways to connect with them over shared interests. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt deliberate. I decided to test my theory. There was this guy, Jake, who I'd met at one of my art society meetings. He wasn't my usual type, kind of quiet and bookish, but he had this sweet, genuine way about him that made me feel comfortable. We'd been talking casually for a while, and I could tell he was interested. I didn't mention him to Lila. Not a word. I wanted to see what would happen if I kept him completely out of our conversations. For a couple of weeks, everything was great. Jake and I started hanging out more, grabbing coffee between classes and sharing little inside jokes. It felt like the first time in a long time that something was going right. And then, out of nowhere, Lila brought him up. "So, this Jake guy in your art society, what's he like?" she asked one evening while we were studying in our dorm. I froze, trying to keep my expression neutral. "How do you know about Jake?" "Oh, I ran into him at the library the other day," she said casually, flipping a page in her notebook. "We started talking about this exhibit at the gallery downtown. He's really into modern art, isn't he?" My stomach dropped. Jake hadn't mentioned seeing Lila, and the fact that she was already chatting him up about his interests felt way too familiar. "He is," I said carefully. Why were you talking to him? Lila gave me a look, like the question was ridiculous. I don't know, it just happened. Relax, it's not like I'm stealing your boyfriend or something. It was meant as a joke, but the words hit me harder than they should have. The next day, I asked Jake about it. I tried to sound casual, but I couldn't hide the edge in my voice. So, you met Lila? He nodded, smiling. Yeah, she's cool. Super outgoing. She was telling me about some of the art projects she's worked on. You guys must have a lot of fun living together. I nodded, but inside, I felt like screaming. Lila wasn't even in the art society. What projects was she talking about? And why did she feel the need to make herself seem like a part of my world? That night, I scrolled through Lila's Instagram, looking for anything that might explain what she was doing. Sure enough, there was a new story, a picture of a coffee cup with the caption, "Gallery Talk with Jake, such a deep thinker." Hot beverage artist palette, I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. It was happening again. And this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. After the Jake situation, I couldn't keep pretending things were fine. Lila's behavior wasn't just quirky or misunderstood anymore. It was deliberate. But the worst part? I felt stuck. How do you confront your best friend about something like this without looking paranoid or insecure? I decided to take a step back. I started spending more time on my own, focusing on classes and the art society. Lila didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't care. She was busy with her theater rehearsals and her constant parade of new friends. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, she always found a way to remind me she was still in the middle of my life. One day, I overheard two girls from the theater department talking about Lila. They were sitting a few seats away from me in the library, chatting quietly, but not quietly enough. "Did you hear about her and that guy Jake?" one of them said, her voice dripping with intrigue. "Yeah," the other replied. "Apparently, they've been hanging out a lot." I thought he was into her roommate, though. I froze. My stomach churned as I tried to focus on my notes, but their voices cut through my concentration like knives. Who knows? Lila said he's been texting her nonstop. She's probably just being nice. Nice? Sure. By the time I left the library, I felt like I was walking through a fog. If Lila was going around telling people Jake was interested in her, that was a whole new level of betrayal. It wasn't just her stepping in and taking over, it was her actively rewriting the narrative. That night, I decided to test something. I sent Jake a text. "Hey, just curious, have you been talking to Lila a lot lately? She mentioned you guys were hanging out." His response came quickly. "Not really. We talked at the library once or twice." "Why?" I stared at the message, my heart pounding. He wasn't texting her nonstop. He wasn't hanging out with her like she wanted people to think. She was lying. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Lila wasn't just inserting herself into my life. She was actively manipulating the people around me. And for what? To make herself look better? To tear me down? I couldn't pretend anymore. Something had to give. And for the first time in my life, I started to think about what my world would look like without Lila in it. After Jake's text, everything clicked into place. Lila wasn't just sabotaging my relationships by chance. She was crafting a narrative. She wanted people to believe she was the better option, the one they couldn't help but gravitate toward. And the worst part? She had been doing it for years, right under my nose. I didn't confront her right away. I needed more proof, and honestly, I wasn't ready for the fallout. Instead, I started paying attention to the smaller details, the way she talked about me to others, the way she presented herself when she was around people I cared about, and, sure enough, the cracks kept showing. One night, we were at a party hosted by someone from Lila's theater group. I wasn't in the mood to go, but she insisted, saying it would be good for me to get out of my head. As soon as we arrived, she was in full social butterfly mode, bouncing from group to group. I ended up chatting with this guy named Ryan, a mutual friend of Lila's who was in her theater circle. He was funny, easy to talk to, and surprisingly down-to-earth for someone in that crowd. We hit it off immediately, trading stories about the ridiculous things we'd seen on campus. But then, just as the conversation was getting good, Lila appeared, "Oh my God, Ryan," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him like they were long-lost siblings. "I didn't know you knew my roomie." The way she said it, roomie, felt so deliberate, like she was staking her claim. Ryan laughed, looking a little caught off guard. "Yeah, we just met. She was telling me about this crazy professor she had last semester." Lila beamed, sliding seamlessly into the conversation. Within minutes, she had Ryan's full attention, tossing out inside jokes and anecdotes about their shared theater projects. I stood there, feeling like a ghost, until it became painfully clear I wasn't part of the conversation anymore. I walked away, pretending I needed a drink, but my chest felt tight. This was her MO. Show up, take over, and make sure I faded into the background. Later that night, Ryan found me in the kitchen, looking sheepish. "Hey, sorry about earlier," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Lila has this way of commanding the room, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, she's definitely got a big personality." He hesitated, then added, "She's great, but I was really enjoying talking to you. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime? Just the two of us." It was a sweet gesture, but I couldn't even process it. Lila had already left her mark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd find a way to derail this too. When I got back to our dorm that night, Lila was already in bed, scrolling through her phone. "Fun night, huh?" she said without looking up. I didn't answer. I just crawled into bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering how much longer I could keep pretending this was normal. Something had to change. And soon, that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, everything became clear. Every doubt, every moment that had felt off, every small comment that chipped away at my confidence, it all added up. Lila wasn't just a bad friend. She wasn't just competitive or attention-seeking. She was sabotaging me, deliberately and systematically, and I finally understood why. I don't know when it started, maybe back in high school, maybe even earlier, but somewhere along the way, Lila stopped seeing me as her best friend and started seeing me as her competition. Maybe it was jealousy over how people complimented me more, or maybe it was her own insecurities. Whatever the reason, she'd made it her mission to make sure I stayed in her shadow. The little digs about my appearance, the way she undermined my relationships, the way she swooped in and made everything about her, it wasn't accidental. It was calculated. I couldn't stop replaying all the moments I'd ignored or brushed aside over the years. The guys she'd accidentally ended up dating after I showed interest. The way she framed herself as my guide or savior to other people, like I couldn't manage my own life. The way she made me feel like I was lucky to have her in my corner when all she'd been doing was holding me back. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep letting her manipulate me, twist my reality, and sabotage everything I worked for. I couldn't keep pretending that this was a friendship. I had to end it, but it wasn't going to be easy. Lila was the kind of person who thrived on control, and I knew she'd try to spin this into another situation where I looked like the bad guy. If I was going to walk away, I needed to be firm. No room for doubts, no room for her charm to rope me back in. I spent the day making a plan. I wrote down everything, every time she'd undermined me, every time she'd stepped into my relationships, every time she'd made me feel less than. It was cathartic, putting it all into words, and by the end of it, I felt more sure of myself than I had in years. That evening, when she came back to our dorm, laughing about something from her theater group, I knew it was time. "Hey, can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady. She looked up, surprised. "Sure, what's up?" I took a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about our friendship, and I've realized it's not working for me anymore. Her smile faltered, and for the first time, she looked genuinely caught off guard. "Wait, what? What are you talking about?" "I mean, I don't think this is a healthy friendship. I felt like I'm constantly being undermined, and it's affecting me in ways I can't ignore anymore." She blinked, her expression shifting from confusion to something colder. "Are you serious right now? After everything we've been through?" I nodded. "I am. I've let a lot of things slide because I cared about you, but I can't do it anymore. I need space to figure out who I am without constantly feeling like I'm competing with you." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in her head, her charm and manipulation spinning into overdrive, but for the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel unsure. I felt free. Lila finally spoke, her voice sharp. "Well, if that's how you feel, maybe you were never really my friend to begin with." Her words stung, but I didn't let them break me. I just nodded, stood up, and walked out of the room. Ending a friendship isn't easy, especially one that's lasted your entire life. But sometimes, letting go is the only way to grow. It's been a few months since I walked out of that dorm room and out of Lila's life at first. It felt like I was untethered. Losing someone who's been part of your life for so long, even when that person has been toxic, leaves a void. I kept second-guessing myself, wondering if I'd been too harsh, if I'd overreacted. But every time I started to spiral, I'd remind myself of all the little ways Lila had chipped away at me, all the ways she'd made me feel like I was never enough. Cutting her out wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. I moved into a new dorm with a girl from the art society named Clara. She's the total opposite of Lila, quiet, supportive, and someone who genuinely listens when I talk. For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. Without Lila in the picture, I started focusing on myself. I threw myself into my art, spending hours in the studio experimenting with different techniques. It was messy and imperfect, but it was mine, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to seek anyone else's approval. I also started hanging out with people who didn't know me as Lila's roommate, or the other half of Lila's duo. They just knew me as me. It's been refreshing to be around people who don't have any preconceived notions, who don't compare me to someone else every time I open my mouth. As for guys, well, I'm not rushing into anything. After everything that happened, I've realized I need time to figure out who I am and what I want before diving into another relationship. It's been nice, though, to just talk to people without feeling like someone's watching my every move, waiting to swoop in. The best part? I've started to feel comfortable in my own skin again. Lila and I haven't spoken since that night, and I don't plan to reach out. I've heard through mutual friends that she's still her same old self, charming, dramatic, and always at the center of attention. And that's fine. She can be whoever she wants to be, but I've finally learned to be okay with who I am. I'm no longer living in someone else's shadow, no longer questioning my every move or doubting my worth. Life isn't perfect, but it's simpler now. And for the first time in a long time, it feels like it's truly mine. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. Sometimes, letting go of someone you thought would be in your life forever is the hardest thing to do. But sometimes, it's the only way to move forward.